For millennia, the vast territory we know today as Latin America remained unexplored by humanity, a land of impenetrable jungles, towering mountains, and seemingly endless rivers. But one day long ago, a group of nomadic hunters arrived from distant lands, unaware that their journey would mark the beginning of one of the most fascinating stories on the planet. The first traces of human presence in the Americas date back more than 15,000 years, although some findings suggest that occupation may have occurred even earlier. During the last ice age, when ice trapped enormous amounts of water and the oceans were at lower levels, a natural bridge connected Asia to the Americas. It was the Bering Strait, a strip of frozen land that served as a portal to an unknown world. These early settlers, driven by the need for food in new lands, crossed it without imagining that they were taking the first step in the history of the continent. However, the passage through Beringia was not the only route of arrival. Recent research has raised the possibility that human groups arrived in South America across the Pacific Ocean, sailing from the islands of Southeast Asia, or even from Europe across the Atlantic. The diversity of archaeological traces found throughout the continent, such as the remains in Monte Verde, Chile, dating back at least 14,000 years, challenge traditional theories and raise new questions about the true origins of the first Americans. Those early explorers were not civilizations like those that would later emerge in the Americas, but small groups of nomads who relied on hunting and gathering to survive. With spears and rudimentary tools, they pursued enormous beasts like the megatherium, the toxodon, and the legendary mammoths, colossal creatures that would soon disappear due to overhunting and climate change. Little by little, these peoples began to expand, settling in different parts of the Americas. Geographical conditions shaped their lifestyles. While some lived in lush tropical forests, others learned to endure in arid deserts or on the icy peaks of the Andes. The continent became a mosaic of developing cultures, each adapting to its environment with ingenuity and perseverance. But there was something else. At some point in history, these people stopped relying exclusively on hunting and discovered humanity's greatest revolution, agriculture. Around 10,000 BC, the domestication of plants marked the end of nomadism for many communities. In the fertile valleys of Mexico, ancient inhabitants began experimenting with the cultivation of maize, a crop that would eventually become the sustenance of great civilizations. In South America, potatoes and quinoa became essential in the diet of the early Andean peoples. The ability to store food brought stability and allowed for the creation of the first settlements. Villages began to multiply, and with them arose the need for organization, shared norms, and shared beliefs. The first form of society in Latin America was born. One of the earliest examples of civilization on the continent was Caral, on the present-day Peruvian coast. More than 5,000 years old, Caral is considered the oldest city in the Americas and rivals the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt in age. Its pyramids, plazas, and temples suggest a high degree of planning, as well as a complex social system based on cooperation and trade. Carol's footsteps, laying the foundations for the great empires that would later astonish the world. However, before the splendor of the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas took shape, the continent still had much to discover. The journey of these early settlers was just the beginning of a history marked by resilience, innovation, and the indomitable spirit of its inhabitants. The land was ready to give way to the first great civilizations that would change the destiny of America forever. Time passed, and those first inhabitants of the Americas, who had once roamed the continent as nomads, gradually abandoned their nomadic life. With the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals, humanity experienced one of its greatest transformations, the establishment of the first permanent villages. This change not only meant a secure supply of food, but also gave way to a more complex social structure. Thus were born the first civilizations of Latin America, societies that thrived in the mountains, jungles, and coasts, laying the foundations for the great empires that would dominate the region centuries later. But how did these civilizations really begin? To understand, we must go back thousands of years, when small human groups, scattered across the continent, took their first steps toward building an organized society. One of the earliest and most enigmatic settlements in the Americas was Caral, located in present-day Peru. Dating back more than 5,000 years, Carol represents the continent's first great civilization and one of the oldest in the world. Its existence demonstrates that, long before the splendor of the Incas, advanced societies already existed in the Andes. Carol was no ordinary city. Its inhabitants built monumental pyramids, circular plazas, and an intricate network of homes and public buildings. Although no evidence of armies or defensive walls has been found, the city prospered for over 1,000 years, suggesting that its stability depended not on warfare, but on trade and social organization. Its economy revolved around the exchange of goods such as cotton, dried fish, and fruits in a trade network that spanned various regions of present-day Peru. Carol's great mysteries is its knowledge of engineering and mathematics. The pyramids were designed with such precision that they withstood the violent earthquakes that struck the region. Furthermore, musical instruments made from animal bones have been found, indicating that music and culture played an important role in society. But while Carol flourished on the Pacific coast, in the north of the continent, in what is now Mexico, another great civilization was beginning to emerge, the Olmecs. Between 1500 and 400 BC, a civilization emerged in the coastal region of the Gulf of Mexico that laid the foundation for all subsequent cultures, the Olmecs. Known as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs pioneered various aspects that would later be adopted by the Maya, Zapotecs, and Aztecs. One of its most impressive legacies is the colossal stone heads, sculptures up to 3 meters tall and weighing several tons, carved with astonishing precision. These heads, found at sites such as La Venta and San Lorenzo, represent rulers or military leaders and reveal the civilization's high artistic and organizational level. The Olmecs were also the first to develop a hieroglyphic writing system, the concept of the mathematical zero, and a calendar that would later be perfected by the Maya. They also played a ball game with profound religious and political connotations, a sport that would remain alive in Mesoamerica for centuries. The heart of the Olmec civilization lay in their ceremonial centers, where pyramidal platforms were erected and rituals dedicated to their gods were held, especially the jaguar deity, a symbol of power and mysticism. Although their civilization mysteriously collapsed around 400 BC, its influence spread throughout the region and left an indelible mark on subsequent cultures. While the Olmecs dominated the Mesoamerican landscape, an equally influential culture was emerging in the Andes, the Chavan. Located in present-day Peru, the Chavan civilization flourished between 1200 and 400 BC, and its legacy was so significant that many consider it the first great Andean culture. Unlike the Olmecs, whose power lay in politics and economics, the Chavan built their influence on a religious foundation. Their ceremonial center, Chavan de Huantar, was not just an architectural site, but a place of pilgrimage where thousands of people traveled to participate in sacred rituals. One of the most enigmatic elements of this culture is the monolithic Lanzan, an imposing stone sculpture carved with figures of jaguars, eagles, and serpents, which appears to have been the center of religious worship. Chavan iconography, with its complex depictions of anthropomorphic beings and feline deities, suggests that their priests held absolute power over the population. In addition to their religious influence, the Chavan also excelled in architecture, constructing intricate drainage systems to prevent flooding in their sacred city. Although their civilization collapsed, their art and traditions were adopted by many subsequent cultures in the Andes. The Carol, the Olmec, and the Chavan marked the beginning of a new era in Latin America. Their achievements in architecture, astronomy, religion, and social organization laid the groundwork for the rise of the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas, the civilizations that would later dominate the continent. However, these primitive peoples did not disappear without a trace. Their knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, influencing subsequent cultures. For example, the use of corn as a sacred crop and staple food, the veneration of sun and rain gods, and the construction of pyramid-shaped temples were practices inherited by later peoples. As these civilizations grew, the continent was transformed. In the jungles of Guatemala and Yucatan, the Maya built majestic cities like Tikal and Palenque. In the valleys of Mexico, the Teotihuacans built one of the largest cities of the ancient world. And in the Andes, centuries later, The Inca would expand their empire from Quito to Santiago, Chile. But the path to greatness was not easy. These civilizations faced internal and external challenges that would test their resilience. In the next chapter, we'll explore the rise of these great empires and how they managed to dominate vast swathes of territory, leaving a legacy that still resonates in Latin American history. Deep in the jungles, on high mountains, and in the vast valleys of Latin America, societies emerged that brought civilization to its peak. For centuries, pre-Columbian peoples developed vast urban centers, mastering architecture, astronomy, and engineering with a precision that continues to astonish humanity. These civilizations, long before the arrival of Europeans, had already created vast and complex empires with political and military structures that rivaled those of the ancient world. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas were not simply advanced cultures. They were true empires that left an indelible legacy in the history of Latin America. Their rise was marked not only by territorial and economic growth, but also by a unique worldview that integrated religion, science, and warfare in an extraordinary balance. In the heart of Mesoamerica, in the present-day regions of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in history flourished, the Maya. Their origins date back to 2000 BC, but their greatest splendor occurred between the 3rd and 9th centuries AD, when they built imposing cities such as Tikal, Copan, Palenque, and Chichen Itza. The most astonishing thing about the Maya was not only their monumental architecture, but their incredible knowledge of time and the universe. Through precise observation of the sky, they created an astronomical calendar so accurate that it surpassed the Julian calendar used in Europe at the time. Their hieroglyphic writing system is the most advanced in pre-Hispanic America, allowing them to record historical events, royal dynasties, and myths in codices and stone steles. But not everything in Mayan society was science and art. They were also relentless warriors, organizing armies and conquering territories through alliances and wars. Their cities were independent states that competed with each other for control of trade and resources. This same system, which allowed them to expand, eventually led to their decline. Between the 9th and 10th centuries, the great southern Mayan cities were abandoned, mired in internal conflicts and environmental crises that fragmented their civilization. However, the Mayan culture did not disappear. On the Yucatan Peninsula, Chichen Itza and other cities survived until the arrival of the Spanish, lasting longer than other Mesoamerican empires. As the Mayans left their legacy in the south, in the central highlands of Mexico, a new empire emerged with overwhelming force. The Aztecs, also known as the Mexica, were people who managed to transform a small island in the middle of Lake Texcoco into the most impressive city on the continent, Tenochtitlan. According to their mythology, their chief god, Huitzilopochtli, ordered them to look for an eagle devouring a snake atop a prickly pear cactus. There they would have found their city. In 1325 AD, they found the sign and began construction of their capital. What they accomplished in just 2 centuries was astounding. At its peak, Tenochtitlan had over 250,000 inhabitants, with enormous temples, floating causeways, and a complex system of chinampas that allowed them to farm on the water. Aztec power was based on their military prowess. Through alliances and wars, they formed the Triple Alliance, dominating a vast territory that stretched from central Mexico to Guatemala. They demanded tribute from conquered peoples and used their prisoners as sacrifices in their religious rituals, convinced that this was maintaining the balance of the universe. But Aztec rule was not without its enemies. Many of the peoples they subdued saw them as oppressors and waited for an opportunity to rebel. This would prove crucial to their ultimate fate when, in 1519, the Spanish conquistadors landed on their shores. While the Mayans were building pyramids in the jungle and the Aztecs were erecting temples on their fortified island, an empire was being formed in the South American Andes that would challenge the most hostile geography of the continent, the Inca Empire. The Incas did not emerge as a power immediately. For centuries, various kingdoms and cultures inhabited the Andean region, but it was in the 15th century that a visionary leader, Pachacutec, transformed a small state into the largest empire in the Americas. From their capital, Cusco, The Incas extended their rule from present-day Ecuador to Chile, covering more than 2,500,000 square kilometers. Their success was due to their incredible organizational skills. They created a road network of more than 40,000 kilometers, known as the Capac Nan, which allowed communication throughout the empire. Without writing, they developed a record-keeping system based on strings and knots called quipu, which they used to manage trade and the population. Unlike the Aztecs, who ruled with brutality, the Incas adopted a strategy of integration. They allowed the conquered peoples to maintain their customs, as long as they accepted the authority of the Sapa Inca and adopted the worship of the sun god Inti. This policy of assimilation prevented mass rebellions and consolidated the empire. One of his greatest achievements was the construction of Machu Picchu, a sacred city hidden among the mountains, designed with impressive architectural precision that withstood earthquakes without the need for mortar. But like the Aztecs, the Incas faced their fate when European conquistadors set foot on their territory. Francisco Pizarro and his men took advantage of the empire's internal disputes to capture Atahualpa, the last Sapa Inca, and dismantle the empire in just a few years. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas marked the pinnacle of pre-Columbian civilizations. Their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture rivaled the advances of the ancient world. But beyond their achievements, what truly defines them is their legacy. Today, the Mayan languages are still spoken in Guatemala and Mexico. The descendants of the Incas preserve their traditions in the Andes, and the Aztec heritage lives on in Mexican culture. Despite the fall of their empires, their history has not been erased. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the arrival of Europeans changed the destiny of Latin America forever. A meeting of two worlds that triggered one of the most dramatic transformations in history: conquest and colonization. In 1492, an unexpected event changed the destiny of Latin America forever. A Genoese navigator, financed by the Spanish crown, set sail in search of a new route to the Indies, little imagining that his voyage would take him to an unknown continent. Christopher Columbus, by landing in what is now the Caribbean, marked the beginning of a process that would radically transform pre-Columbian civilizations. What began as an encounter between two worlds soon became a brutal clash of cultures, ideas, and powers. The arrival of Europeans brought with it the advancement of exploration, the expansion of European empires, and the collapse of the great indigenous empires. It was a time of discovery, but also of violence, disease, and exploitation. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean islands, he found a world that seemed exotic and full of riches. The Taino and Carib people, inhabitants of the region, greeted him with curiosity, unaware that their lives would soon change forever. In his journal, Columbus described these people as hospitable and peaceful, but he also noted their lack of weapons and their apparent vulnerability. The first contact between Europeans and indigenous people was relatively peaceful. Columbus exchanged objects of little value with the natives, impressing them with glass beads and mirrors. However, his main objective was to find gold, and since he didn't find much in the Caribbean, he sent reports back to Spain assuring them that those lands were full of undiscovered treasures. Columbus's return to Europe with news of the New World sparked a fever of exploration. In the following years, the Spanish began arriving in large numbers, establishing the first settlements and subduing the local populations. The conquistadors' ambition did not stop at the Caribbean islands. When rumors of the riches of the Aztec and Inca empires reached the ears of the Spanish crown, a new phase of colonization began: the conquest. In 1519, a Spanish adventurer named Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with a small army of about 600 men. His goal was to explore and, if possible, seize the territories he found. As he advanced inland, Cortés realized that the Aztec Empire had numerous enemies. Many of the tribes subdued by the Aztecs resented Tenochtitlan's rule, and Cortés took advantage of this situation to his advantage. The meeting between Cortés and the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, was a moment of tension and uncertainty. Moctezuma, believing the Spanish might be messengers of the gods, allowed them into the city. But what began as a diplomatic exchange soon turned into a bloodbath. In 1521, after fierce battles, alliances with local tribes, and the spread of European diseases like smallpox, Tenochtitlan fell. What had once been the greatest city in the Americas lay in ruins, and the Aztec Empire ceased to exist. On its foundations, the Spanish began building a new metropolis, Mexico City. While Mexico was falling into the hands of the conquistadors, a similar story was unfolding in the south of the continent. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro and a group of fewer than 200 soldiers reached the territories of the Inca Empire. At the time, the empire was weakened by a civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar, who were fighting for the throne. Pizarro, seeing the internal divisions, took advantage of the situation. With an ambush in the city of Cajamarca, he managed to capture Atahualpa, demanding a huge ransom in gold and silver. Despite receiving the payment, the Spanish executed the emperor and continued their advance toward Cusco, the Inca capital, which fell in 1533. The Incas, without a unifying leader and facing superior Spanish weapons, were unable to stop the invasion. Although resistance continued for decades in the mountains, the empire that once ruled the Andes had come to an end. The fall of the great pre-Columbian empires not only meant the loss of autonomy for indigenous peoples, but also a radical change in their way of life. The arrival of the Spanish transformed the social, political, and economic structure of the entire region. One of the most devastating effects of the arrival of Europeans was the introduction of diseases to which the indigenous people had no defenses. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus spread with deadly speed. In less than a century, the indigenous population was reduced by 80%, causing an unprecedented catastrophe. It is estimated that before the arrival of the Spanish, the continent had between 50 and 60 million inhabitants. By the 17th century, that number had dropped dramatically. In some places, such as the Caribbean islands, entire populations were wiped out. After the conquest, Spain established a system of viceroyalties, dividing its territories in the Americas into large provinces governed by representatives of the king. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico and Central America, and the Viceroyalty of Peru were created, responsible for managing indigenous wealth and labor. To exploit the resources, the Spanish imposed the encomienda, a system in which indigenous people were forced to work for the colonizers in exchange for protection and religious education. This system soon became a form of hidden slavery, leading to abuse and exploitation. Although the conquest was brutal, it wasn't all destruction. With the arrival of the Europeans, a process of cultural and biological fusion began that gave rise to Latin American society as we know it today. The Spanish brought their language, religion, and customs, while the indigenous people maintained many of their traditions, blending them with new influences. Thus, a hybrid culture was born, in which European, African, and indigenous elements mingled in food, music, art, and religion. Colonial cities grew upon ancient civilizations, and the first universities and cathedrals were built on the continent. But the history of Latin America would not be one of total submission. Throughout the centuries, indigenous communities resisted, and their legacy lives on in the continent's identity. The arrival of Europeans in America not only changed the history of the continent, but that of the entire world. The conquest began the exchange of products, animals, and technologies between the continents. America gave the world corn, cocoa, potatoes, and tomatoes, while Europe brought horses, firearms, and diseases. However, the arrival of Europeans did not mean the end of indigenous history. Resistance would continue for centuries, and in the next chapter, we will explore how, despite colonization, Latin American peoples forged their own identity, laying the groundwork for future struggles for independence. Following the fall of the great pre-Columbian empires, Latin America entered a new phase of its history. For more than 3 centuries, the continent was dominated by European powers, primarily Spain and Portugal, which established a colonial system based on economic exploitation, political control, and cultural imposition. This was the era in which the first colonial cities were built, the borders of future countries were drawn, and the mestizo society that defines Latin America today was shaped. But colonization was not just a process of domination. It was also a period of resistance, adaptation, and cultural fusion. In this chapter, we will explore how this new society was shaped and how, despite oppression, indigenous, African, and mixed-race peoples managed to keep their identities alive in a world that was trying to transform them. To administer its vast territories in the Americas, the Spanish crown established a system of viceroyalties. The first was the Viceroyalty of New Spain, 1535, which encompassed Mexico, Central America, and parts of the United States. Then, in 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru was created, with jurisdiction over South America except for Brazil, which was under Portuguese rule. Later, in the 18th century, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, 1739, and the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, 1776, would be formed to improve administration. Each viceroyalty was governed by a viceroy, who represented the King of Spain and had absolute authority over the territories. But beneath the viceroy, a complex bureaucracy administered every corner of the empire, with courts, corregidors, and town councils charged with collecting taxes, administering justice, and maintaining order. In the cities, the Spanish model was replicated. Cobblestone streets, main squares, and imposing cathedrals became the center of colonial life. Lima, Mexico City, Bogota, and Buenos Aires emerged as major cities that reflected European influence, but with their own distinct identity. The Latin American economy during the colonial era revolved around the exploitation of natural resources. The Spanish crown imposed a system based on the extraction of wealth, primarily precious metals, which were then sent to Europe to sustain the empire. The mines of Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico became centers of silver production, generating enormous wealth for the Spanish monarchy. However, labor in the mines was brutal. Thousands of indigenous people were forced to work in inhumane conditions under the Mita, a system of compulsory labor that subjected them to grueling hours and extremely high mortality rates. In addition to mining, the colonial economy was supported by agriculture and livestock. Large estates and plantations were established, producing sugarcane, cocoa, tobacco, and cotton for export. To supply these plantations, the colonizers resorted to slave labor brought from Africa. Colonial trade was strictly controlled by Spain. Trade was only permitted between the Americas and the mother country, and direct contact with other European countries was prohibited. This system, known as a trade monopoly, generated smuggling and encouraged piracy in the Caribbean. Society in colonial America was divided into a rigid caste system, where ethnic origin determined the place each person occupied. 1. The Peninsulars. They were the Spaniards born in the Iberian Peninsula and held the highest positions in the government and the church. 2. The Creoles, descendants of Spaniards born in America. Although they had economic power, they were excluded from the most important political positions, which would generate tensions that would explode in the 19th century. 3. The Mestizos, a product of the mixture of Europeans and indigenous peoples. They became the majority of the population and played diverse roles in society. 4. The indigenous. They were at the base of the social pyramid and subjected to exploitation in mines, haciendas, and encomiendas. Although the laws of the Indies attempted to protect them, in practice they suffered constant abuse. 5. Afro-descendants. They arrived as slaves to work on plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil. Over time, some managed to purchase their freedom and form autonomous communities called palenques or quilombos. This caste system not only established social differences, but also influenced the cultural identity of Latin America. The blending of races and traditions created a diversity unique in the world. One of the pillars of colonization was evangelization. The Spanish crown, with the support of the Pope, believed it had the mission to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. To this end, missions were established and churches were built throughout the Americas. Religious orders, such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, played a crucial role in the conversion and education of the indigenous population. Religious texts were translated into native languages, and indigenous beliefs were syncretized with Christianity. This is how figures such as the Virgin of Guadalupe emerged in Mexico, combining elements of the Catholic religion with indigenous symbols. However, evangelization was not always peaceful. In many cases, indigenous temples and codices were destroyed, and those who resisted were persecuted by the Inquisition, an institution charged with punishing heresy. Despite Spanish rule, resistance never ceased. From the early years of the conquest, indigenous peoples rose up against the colonizers. Among the most important rebellions were the Rebellion of Tupac Amaru II, 1780 to 1783, in the Viceroyalty of Peru, where thousands of indigenous and mestizo people rose up against Spanish abuse. The uprising of the Mapuches in Chile, who resisted conquest for centuries and managed to maintain their independence longer than other civilizations. African slave revolts, such as the Yanga Revolt in Mexico or the formation of the Quilombo de Palmares in Brazil, where enslaved people escaped and created autonomous communities. These uprisings were brutally suppressed, but they laid the groundwork for future independence movements. At the end of the 18th century, tensions in the Americas began to rise. The ideas of the Enlightenment, which promoted liberty and equality, reached the continent and inspired Creoles to question Spanish rule. Furthermore, the French Revolution and the independence of the United States demonstrated that it was possible to break away from the control of a metropolis. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe weakened Spain, creating the perfect setting for Latin America to begin its fight for independence in the early 19th century. In the next chapter, we will explore how revolutionary leaders, such as Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Miguel Hidalgo, started a war that would change the destiny of the continent forever. At the end of the 18th century, Latin America was a territory dominated by Spain and Portugal, but social and political tensions were beginning to reach their peak. After nearly 3 centuries of colonial rule, the subjugated peoples were beginning to question the authority of the European crowns. The abuses of the viceregal administration, the exploitation of indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, and the exclusion of Creoles from political office provided the breeding ground for a series of uprisings that would change the destiny of the continent. But independence didn't come overnight. Before the Latin American republics were consolidated, there were revolts, conspiracies, and bloody wars that would last for decades. The struggle for freedom not only pitted Creoles against Spain, but also divided society itself, as not everyone was convinced they would break with the mother country. In this chapter, we will explore the causes of independence, the first failed attempts, and the great military feats that gave rise to a new era in Latin America. The wars of independence were not isolated events. They were the result of a long process that developed over years and had various causes. The Creoles, descendants of Spaniards born in the Americas, were a wealthy and powerful elite, but they were excluded from high administrative and military positions, which were reserved for peninsulars. Despite being the main producers of wealth in the region, they had no political power. This generated resentment and a growing belief that the Creoles should govern their own territories. The ideas of philosophers such as John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau crossed the Atlantic and began to inspire enlightened Creoles. The notion that sovereignty resided in the people and that the government should serve society rather than oppress it began to permeate the minds of many Latin American intellectuals and leaders. The success of the United States independence in 1776 and the fall of the French monarchy in 1789 demonstrated that it was possible to overthrow an oppressive government. Latin America saw these events as an example to follow and began to consider independence an achievable goal. The final blow to Spanish control in the Americas came when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain and captured King Ferdinand VII. In his place, Napoleon placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. This created a crisis of legitimacy in the viceroyalties, as many colonies did not recognize a foreign king. The Creoles took advantage of the chaos in the metropolis to seize control of their territories and declare their autonomy. The struggle for independence did not begin with a major war, but with small revolts and conspiracies that were quickly suppressed by the Spanish authorities. However, these initial attempts marked the beginning of the emancipation movement. One of the first uprisings against Spanish rule occurred in the Viceroyalty of Peru. José Gabriel Condorcanqui, known as Tupac Amaru II, was a mestizo descendant of the Incas who led a rebellion against the abuses of the Spanish corregidors. Although his movement managed to mobilize thousands of indigenous and mestizo people, it was brutally suppressed. Tupac Amaru II was captured, tortured, and executed in 1781, but his name remains in the collective memory as a symbol of resistance. In the Viceroyalty of New Granada, present-day Colombia, a group of peasants and indigenous people led a revolt against the high taxes and trade monopoly imposed by Spain. Although they managed to negotiate with the authorities, the movement was crushed when royal troops regained control. In the Caribbean, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, experienced the first slave-led revolution in history. Under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved defeated the French, British, and Spanish armies, achieving independence in 1804. This event inspired slaves and Afro-descendants in Latin America, generating fear in the Creole elites, who wanted independence, but without a social revolution. Between 1810 and 1830, Latin America became a battleground. The wars of independence were protracted and violent struggles, led by leaders who would become the liberators of their nations. The independence movement in Mexico began with the priest Miguel Hidalgo, who on September 16, 1810, issued the Cry of Dolores, calling for rebellion against Spanish rule. His army of peasants advanced rapidly but was defeated. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, but his legacy continued with José María Morelos, who wrote Mexico's first constitution. In northern South America, Simón Bolívar, an enlightened Creole, led a series of military campaigns that resulted in the independence of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. After years of fighting, in 1821, Bolívar achieved one of his greatest victories at the Battle of Carabobo, sealing Venezuela's independence. While Bolívar fought in the north, José de San Martín led the southern struggle for independence. In 1817, he crossed the Andes with an army to liberate Chile, achieving victory at the Battle of Chacabuco. Then, in 1821, he entered Lima and declared Peru's independence. On December 9, 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, General Antonio José de Sucre defeated the last royalist army in South America, ending Spanish rule in the region. With this victory, the continent's independence was consolidated. With independence achieved, Latin America entered a new era. However, freedom did not bring immediate stability. The young republics faced internal conflicts, civil wars, and economic problems. Military warlords seized power in many regions, and the differences between Creoles, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and Afro-descendants became obstacles to the construction of unified nations. In the next chapter, we will explore how the new Latin American republics attempted to consolidate their position in the 19th century, facing political, social, and economic challenges that would shape the future of the continent. The Wars of Independence marked the beginning of a new era in Latin America. By 1830, most of the continent had freed itself from Spanish and Portuguese rule, giving way to the birth of sovereign republics. However, independence did not bring immediate stability or prosperity. On the contrary, the 19th century was marked by internal conflicts, caudillismo, civil wars, and economic crises that hampered the consolidation of the new states. The fledgling republics faced monumental challenges: a lack of national unity, disputes between liberals and conservatives, foreign intervention, and territorial fragmentation. What should have been a century of consolidation and growth became an era of struggle to define Latin America's political and social identity. In this chapter, we'll explore the turbulent 19th century and how the ideals of liberty gave way to a much more complex reality. When the Independence Army succeeded in expelling the Royalists, the Latin American nations faced a fundamental dilemma: how to govern themselves. For centuries, power had been centralized in the Spanish crown, so there was no prior experience in governing democratic republics. The first governments attempted to establish constitutions inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution and the independence of the United States. However, it soon became clear that the Latin American reality was different. Deep social and economic inequalities, coupled with a lack of infrastructure and education, made the implementation of stable democratic models difficult. Furthermore, former independence leaders, such as Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, had differing visions of how Latin America should be organized. While Bolívar dreamed of a large, united confederation, Gran Colombia, integrating Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, reality proved to be too strong. In 1831, Gran Colombia dissolved and each territory became an independent nation. In Mexico, independence brought even more instability. In 1821, Agustin de Iturbide proclaimed himself emperor, but his reign lasted less than 2 years before he was overthrown and replaced by a republic in 1824. From then on, Mexico went through a series of political conflicts that led to the loss of much of its territory to the United States in the 1846 to 1848 war. In the absence of solid institutions and stable governments, a figure emerged that would dominate Latin American politics for much of the 19th century: the caudillo. Caudillos were military and political leaders who controlled vast territories through force, patronage, and the loyalty of their followers. These men, in many cases former heroes of the independence movement, became authoritarian rulers who imposed their will above the law. Among the most influential leaders of the 19th century are Juan Manuel de Rosas, Argentina. He ruled with an iron fist, imposing a regime of control and repression on his opponents. Antonio López de Santa Anna, Mexico. He governed on multiple occasions and lost Texas and half of the Mexican territory to the United States. José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, Paraguay. He isolated Paraguay from the rest of the world and established an extremely centralized government. Caudillismo was a complex phenomenon. On the one hand, these leaders offered stability in times of crisis. On the other, they prevented the creation of democratic institutions and consolidated power structures based on personal loyalty rather than the rule of law. The 19th century was marked by internal wars and conflicts between countries, which contributed to the chronic instability of the region. In almost all Latin American countries, society was divided into two large factions: the liberals, who sought to reduce the power of the church, decentralize government, and establish more open economies; the conservatives, who defended the power of the Catholic Church, centralism, and the social structures inherited from the colonial era. These ideological differences led to endless civil wars, such as in Colombia, where clashes between liberals and conservatives were constant throughout the century. One of the most destructive conflicts of the 19th century was the War of the Triple Alliance, in which Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay united against Paraguay. The war left Paraguay devastated, with more than half of its population dead and its economy in ruins. Another important conflict was the War of the Pacific, in which Chile, Bolivia, and Peru fought for control of the saltpeter-rich territories of the Atacama Desert. Chile emerged victorious, annexing Bolivian and Peruvian territories and leaving Bolivia without access to the sea, a conflict that continues to generate tensions today. As Latin America sought to consolidate its governments, foreign powers began to intervene in the region with the aim of expanding their economic and political influence. United States and the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. With the famous phrase, "America for the Americans," the United States declared that it would not allow European powers to intervene on the continent. However, this did not mean that it respected Latin American sovereignty, as in the following decades it imposed its economic and military dominance on the region. France and the intervention in Mexico, 1862 to 1867. In an attempt to expand its empire, France installed Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg in Mexico, with the support of conservatives. However, the liberal leader Benito Juárez managed to defeat the French and restore the Republic in 1867. Great Britain and the Latin American economy. Although it did not participate in wars, Great Britain dominated much of the trade and financed infrastructure, such as railways and ports, becoming the main creditor of several Latin American countries. Despite wars, economic crises, and internal conflicts, some Latin American countries began to achieve a degree of stability by the end of the 19th century. Educational reforms were promoted, infrastructure was modernized, and more organized governments were established, although in many cases they were still controlled by elites. Economies began to rely on the export of raw materials, such as coffee in Brazil and Colombia, beef in Argentina, and silver in Mexico. However, this dependence on foreign markets left countries vulnerable to fluctuations in the global economy. But the 19th century was only the beginning of a long struggle for Latin America's consolidation. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the 20th century brought new challenges, such as revolutions, dictatorships, and the impact of the Cold War on the region. The 20th century marked a new era in the history of Latin America. After a 19th century marked by civil wars, caudillismo, and foreign interventions, the region entered a period of profound political, social, and economic change. However, stability remained elusive. Dictatorships, revolutions, and internal conflicts defined much of this century, as the world's great powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, used Latin America as an ideological battleground during the Cold War. But the 20th century also brought modernization, advances in education, and a growing cultural identity that strengthened the idea of a Latin America united in its diversity. In this chapter, we will explore how the 20th century transformed the region, from revolutionary movements to the impact of globalization on Latin American economies. At the beginning of the 20th century, Latin America experienced a process of economic modernization driven by industrialization and export growth. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico saw booms in agriculture and mining, while new cities grew at a rapid pace. However, this modernization did not benefit everyone equally. Wealth remained concentrated among the elite, while peasants and workers faced precarious working conditions. The lack of labor rights and social inequality soon led to labor movements and strikes in several countries. One of the most emblematic events of this era was the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, a conflict that erupted against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and plunged the country into a decade of internal strife. This revolution not only transformed Mexico with agrarian and labor reforms, but also inspired other revolutionary movements across the continent. During the first half of the 20th century, Latin America was dominated by military dictatorships and authoritarian governments that promised order and progress, but often repressed the population. Among the most notorious dictatorships were Juan Vicente Gómez, Venezuela, 1908 to 1935. He ruled with an iron fist, favoring foreign oil companies while controlling politics with brutality. Rafael Trujillo, Dominican Republic, 1930 to 1961. His regime was one of the most repressive, with a network of espionage and political assassinations. Getulio Vargas, Brazil, 1930 to 1945 and 1951 to 1954. A populist leader who combined modernization policies with strong control of the state. In contrast to dictatorships, populist leaders emerged who offered social reforms and greater mass participation in politics. One of the most influential was Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, 1946 to 1955, whose Peronist movement promoted labor rights and a strong national identity. Populism in Latin America became a powerful political tool, mobilizing the masses with nationalist rhetoric and promises of social justice. However, in many cases, these governments descended into authoritarianism and corruption. With the outbreak of the Cold War, 1947 to 1991, Latin America became a site of dispute between the United States and the Soviet Union. While Washington viewed the region as its backyard and sought to prevent the spread of communism, Moscow supported revolutionary movements and guerrillas that challenged pro-Western governments. The most shocking event of the Cold War in Latin America was the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara. In 1959, revolutionaries overthrew the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista and established a communist regime in Cuba, aligning themselves with the Soviet Union. This alarmed the United States, which attempted to overthrow Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, but failed. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the USSR installed nuclear missiles on the island, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and cemented Cuba's position as a bastion of communism on the continent. The Cuban Revolution inspired guerrilla movements across Latin America, such as the FARC in Colombia, the Sandinista Front in Nicaragua, and the Montoneros in Argentina. Meanwhile, the United States supported military dictatorships to contain the communist advance. Beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, Latin America experienced a wave of military dictatorships, many of them supported by the United States under the National Security Doctrine. The argument was that it was necessary to combat communism, but in reality these regimes were characterized by repression, censorship, and human rights violations. Among the most brutal were Brazil, 1964 to 1985, a military regime that persecuted opponents and censored the press. Chile, 1973 to 1990, the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet overthrew socialist President Salvador Allende in a CIA-backed coup, establishing a repressive regime with thousands of disappearances. Argentina, 1976 to 1983. The military government carried out the Dirty War, in which thousands of people were kidnapped and murdered. Uruguay and Paraguay. They also experienced repressive dictatorships, with persecution and forced disappearances. These governments implemented neoliberal policies, privatizing companies and promoting the free market, which benefited the elites but increased inequality. At the end of the 20th century, most Latin American countries began a transition to democracy. The fall of dictatorships was due to multiple factors: internal erosion, international pressure, and the economic crisis that affected many authoritarian regimes. The new democracies faced great challenges: the external debt, which suffocated Latin American economies; the growth of drug trafficking, with cartels like Medellin and Sinaloa taking control of large areas; social inequality, which persisted despite political changes. However, there was also significant progress. Human rights reforms were passed, democratic institutions were strengthened, and progressive leaders emerged in several countries, such as Lula da Silva in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Globalization brought with it new opportunities and challenges. Latin America became a key player in international trade, but its dependence on raw material exports and political instability remained obstacles to development. The 20th century was a time of radical change for Latin America. From revolutions and dictatorships to the return of democracy, the continent underwent a process of transformation that brought it into the 21st century with new opportunities and challenges. In the next chapter, we'll explore how globalization, technology, and social movements have shaped contemporary Latin America, and what future awaits this region steeped in history and resilience. The 21st century arrived with new promises for Latin America. After decades marked by revolutions, dictatorships, and economic crises, the region entered a period of accelerated change driven by globalization, technological advancement, and the growth of international markets. However, the challenges did not disappear. Inequality, corruption, drug trafficking, and political instability continued to be obstacles to development in many countries. At the same time, social movements, new technologies, and regional integration offered opportunities to transform the continent and propel it into the future. In this chapter, we will explore how globalization has impacted Latin America and what are the most important challenges it faces in the 21st century. Since the end of the 20th century, the world has experienced a process of accelerated globalization, characterized by the growth of international trade, the development of new technologies, and the interconnection of markets. Latin America has not been immune to this phenomenon. Over the past few decades, Latin American countries have sought to strengthen their economies through free trade agreements and strategic alliances. Among the most important agreements are the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, signed in 1994 between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, made Mexico one of the most integrated economies with North America. Mercosur, formed by Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, which promoted trade between South American countries. The Pacific Alliance, a more recent initiative that unites Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile with the goal of strengthening their presence in global markets. These strategies have allowed Latin America to become a key player in sectors such as agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. However, its dependence on raw material exports has created vulnerability to global economic crises. The 21st century has witnessed a digital revolution that has transformed Latin American society. The expansion of internet access and the growth of the technology industry have changed the way people work, communicate, and access education. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina have emerged as technology hubs, with a boom in startups and digital commerce. However, the digital divide remains a challenge, as millions of people in rural areas still lack internet access and technological education. Despite advances in globalization and technology, Latin America faces structural problems that have been difficult to eradicate. Latin America remains one of the most unequal regions in the world. Although some economies have grown in recent decades, wealth distribution remains unfair. While elites amass vast fortunes, millions of people live in extreme poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated this situation, increasing unemployment and informal employment. According to data from international organizations, the health crisis pushed millions of Latin Americans back into poverty, reversing years of social progress. One of the most persistent problems in the region is corruption, from illegal financing scandals to bribery networks involving presidents and businessmen. Corruption has weakened trust in institutions and hindered development. Cases like Lava Jato in Brazil, which revealed a vast corruption network involving political leaders across the region, have shown how impunity remains a critical problem. The lack of transparency in governments has sparked protests and citizen movements in countries such as Chile, Colombia, and Peru, where populations have demanded reforms and a greater commitment to democracy. Drug trafficking and organized crime continue to be one of the main threats to the stability of Latin America. Cartels such as the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, the First Capital Command in Brazil, and the Gulf Clan in Colombia have generated high levels of violence and corruption. Countries like Mexico and Venezuela have recorded alarming homicide rates, with cities ranked among the most dangerous in the world. Weak judicial systems and impunity have allowed organized crime to continue to spread. Latin America is home to the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, but the region faces an unprecedented environmental crisis. Deforestation, pollution, and climate change threaten ecosystems and the indigenous communities that depend on them. The expansion of illegal mining, intensive agriculture, and forest fires have devastated large areas of the Amazon rainforest. International organizations have warned that, without urgent action, the Amazon could reach a point of no return in the coming decades. Despite the challenges, Latin America has witnessed a wave of social movements demanding profound changes in the region. The social outbreak in Chile, 2019. Millions of people took to the streets to protest against inequality and demand a new constitution. Protests in Colombia, 2021. The Colombian people rose up against a tax reform that affected the working classes, demanding better living conditions. The feminist movement. In countries like Argentina and Mexico, the women's rights movement has gained strength, achieving progress on issues such as the legalization of abortion and the fight against gender violence. The struggle of indigenous peoples. Indigenous communities have led protests against megaprojects that threaten their territories and have demanded recognition of their ancestral rights. These movements have demonstrated that Latin America is undergoing a process of social and political transformation. The new generations are more connected, informed, and willing to fight for a more just future. As the 21st century progresses, Latin America faces a crossroads. The region has the potential to become a key global player thanks to its natural resources, cultural diversity, and human capital. However, to achieve sustainable development, it is necessary to address the structural problems that have hindered its growth for centuries. The future of Latin America will depend on its ability to reduce inequality and ensure opportunities for all, fight corruption and strengthen their democracies, develop more diversified economies that are less dependent on raw material exports, protect the environment and stop the climate crisis, promote education and technological innovation to compete in the global economy. Throughout history, Latin America has proven to be a region of resilience, creativity, and struggle. Its destiny is unwritten, and the coming decades will be crucial in defining its course in a constantly changing world. From the earliest pre-columbian civilizations to the globalized world of the 21st century, Latin America has been a territory marked by grandeur, resilience, and the constant struggle to define its destiny. Its lands have seen the birth of legendary empires, resisted the brutality of conquest, forged independent republics, and faced dictatorships, revolutions, and economic crises. But despite the challenges, the Latin American identity has survived, evolving into a unique blend of cultures, traditions, and hopes that continue to shape its future. Today, looking back, we can recognize that the history of Latin America is not just a succession of political events and conflicts. It is the history of its peoples, its art, its music, its literature, its unbreakable spirit. In this final chapter, we will explore the legacy the region has left the world and how its history can serve as a guide for the challenges it still faces. One of Latin America's greatest assets is its culture. The fusion of indigenous, African, and European influences has given rise to a cultural diversity unmatched anywhere else in the world. Latin American literature has impacted the world with writers who have captured the continent's essence. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, with his magical realism in 100 Years of Solitude, transported readers to Macondo, a reflection of the Latin American spirit. Mario Vargas Llosa, Pablo Neruda, Jorge Luis Borges, and Octavio Paz are just a few of the authors who have brought the voice of Latin America to the global stage. But beyond literature, Latin American thought has been a driving force of change. Figures like José Martí and Simón Bolívar shaped the struggle for independence with their vision of unity and freedom. In the 20th century, intellectuals like Eduardo Galeano and Paulo Freire challenged power structures with revolutionary ideas about history and education. From the African rhythms of the Caribbean to the melancholic tangos of Argentina, Latin American music has conquered the world. Brazilian samba, Colombian cumbia, Puerto Rican reggaeton, and Andean music have brought the soul of the region to every corner of the planet. Art, for its part, has been a mirror of the region's history. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo portrayed Mexican identity with vibrant colors and revolutionary messages. Fernando Botero, Oswaldo Guayasamín, and Tarsila do Amaral reflected the struggles and hopes of their people through their art. Despite its immense cultural wealth, Latin America continues to face structural problems that have been a constant throughout its history. Since the colonial era, inequality has been a persistent problem in the region. Although progress has been made in reducing poverty and increasing access to education, the gap between rich and poor remains one of the deepest in the world. Afro-descendant communities, who have historically been marginalized, continue to fight for recognition of their rights. Throughout the continent, social movements have demanded better living conditions, access to education, and an end to discrimination. One of the major obstacles to Latin America's development has been corruption. Entire governments have fallen due to bribery scandals and the misappropriation of public funds. The lack of strong institutions has allowed authoritarian leaders to remain in power through fraudulent practices. Despite this, the region has shown signs of change. In recent years, citizen movements have led to the overthrow of corrupt presidents and promoted reforms to strengthen democracy. The future of Latin America will also depend on how it manages its natural resources. With the Amazon rainforest in danger and pollution affecting millions of people, the region faces a crucial challenge. Indigenous peoples have been the main defenders of nature, fighting against the indiscriminate exploitation of resources. However, pressure from large corporations and the lack of sustainable policies continue to threaten the ecological balance. Since independence, Latin American leaders have dreamed of a united region, capable of facing global challenges with one voice. However, the path to integration has been difficult. Organizations such as CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, and UNASUR have attempted to strengthen cooperation between countries, but political and economic differences have hindered genuine unity. Despite these obstacles, Latin America has shown that when its people unite, they can achieve significant change. The struggles for democracy, human rights, and social justice have been driven by solidarity among the continent's citizens. Latin America is not only its past of empires, colonization, revolutions, and dictatorships. It is also its present and its future. The coming years will determine whether the region can overcome its historical challenges and become a key player in the globalized world. Education, technology, the fight against corruption, and investment in sustainable development will be key to transforming the region. The new generations have the potential to change history. With access to more information than ever before and a greater awareness of social problems, young Latin Americans are the key to building a more just and prosperous region. Latin America has been and will continue to be a territory of struggle and transformation. Its history has been marked by adversity, but also by the resilience and creativity of its people. From the Mayans and the Incas to the modern cities that today vibrate with culture and diversity, the region has demonstrated that its identity cannot be erased or subjugated. Latin America remains a place of hope, where each generation strives for a better future. History isn't written in stone, and although challenges persist, the essence of Latin America is its resilience and indomitable spirit. The destiny of the continent is in the hands of its people, and the next chapter of its history has yet to be written.